Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Psychiatric Exile. This week, we're going to be talking about The Exorcist, another classic movie, and this one happens to be my favorite movie of all time. We'll be taking a look at its psychology and symbolism, concentrating on the character of Father Karras, whom I consider to be the protagonist of the movie. So, the thesis we're going to be working with here is that the movie represents Kara's hero journey. What does that mean? That means rescuing his anima from the grasp of his shadow so that it can be incorporated into his consciousness, resulting in a more complete psyche. So let's explore that a little bit. Let's start with the quote we have here from Carl Jung, because we're going to be using a Jungian framework to try to understand the movie. He says, "Every man carries within himself the eternal image of a woman, not the image of this or that particular woman, but a definite feminine image. This image is fundamentally unconscious, a hereditary factor of primordial origin." So, what Jung is saying here is that in the psyche of every man, there's a feminine component. And that feminine component of the man's or male psyche, he called the anima. Now, that tends to be repressed in a man, and therefore it goes to the unconscious. The shadow, on the other hand, is the totality of the unconscious. The unconscious has two components, according to Jung. The first one is what we leave behind once consciousness emerges, and the other one is the things that we repress during our conscious life. So the totality of those two things he called the shadow. Therefore, when the anima is repressed, it becomes it falls under the grasp of the shadow. It's important to observe that, in contrast to Freud, Jung thought that, in contrast to Freud, who thought that the last psychodevelopmental stage was the genital stage in adolescence, Jung thought that psychological development was necessary throughout the whole cycle. And specifically, when a man's reach when a man reaches middle age, his main task is to incorporate this repressed anima, this repressed feminine component of his psyche into his consciousness, so that he can now have a more complete psychology, more complete mental life. So here we see again the definitions of anima and shadow, and a couple more of Jungian concepts we're going to be needing for this interpretation. The first one is the fact that, according to Jung, there are 4 psychological functions in every person's psyche, and these are organized as 2 pairs of opposites. The first pair of opposite is thinking and feeling. The second pair of opposites is sensation and intuition. Everybody's going to have a dominant function, and that dominant function is going to be conscious. In the case of Father Karras, as we're going to see, his dominant function is thinking. That means that the opposite, which is feeling, is going to be an undifferentiated, repressed function, and this function is going to be unconscious. The other 2 functions, in this case sensation and intuition, are partially conscious and partially unconscious. And once feeling is repressed and goes to the unconscious, then it becomes associated with the anima, which is also there, and the shadow, which is the unconscious itself. So for someone like Karras, whose thinking function was the dominant function, and everything that comes with that, with thinking, logic, reason. His feeling function is now going to be associated with the anima, and the anima is going to be under the grasp of the unconscious. Um, I think this is why we see signs of the consequences of Karras repressing his feeling function. We see it in his attitude towards the homeless man that asks for money. He looks at him with, I don't know, disgust or contempt, anything but love. And we also see it in him losing his faith. You obviously, you cannot keep your faith just with the use of reason. Okay, so according to Jung, and before we jump into the first sequence of the film, a central concept of Jungian theory is that the purpose of myth is the reconciliation of opposites. And he says that this is the case because once consciousness emerges out of the unconscious, there is a tension there between the two that and that tension tries to be reconciliated by the conjunction, by the reconciliation between consciousness and unconsciousness. There's a pull of consciousness towards the unconscious, and it's important not to give in to that pull, because you would lose your awareness, your sense of ego, your sense of identity. So what the myth does is release some of that tension by using symbols, and these symbols represent archetypes, and by doing that, the myth relieves the tension created by the split of conscious and unconscious. This is the concept that was also stated by Levi Strauss from a different perspective, but same concept, especially his book, The Raw and the Cooked. So the very first thing that we see in the movie is the house of where Reagan and her mom live. And right after that, we are shown this image of the Virgin Mary statue. And at that point, it's untouched, it's unsoiled, and it brings all the associations that we normally have with the figure of the Virgin Mary. Purity, she is pure, she is untouched by sin or desire, asexual. Uh, she gave, she had a virgin birth, conceived without sin, according to the Catholic Church, and also her aspects of femininity and motherhood. Then we go to Iraq, and that sequence closes with the encounter of the Pazuzu statue by Mering. In fact, the first manifestation, the first thing we saw of Pazuzu in the movie is as a shadow, because we are seeing Marin's face, and then we see a shadow covering his face, and then we learn that that shadow is projected by the statue of Pazuzu. So we are already being told that Pazuzu is going to be representing the shadow as an archetype, as a structure of the psyche. And this statue is the opposite of the Virgin Mary's. This one is demonic, is grotesque, and is phallic, very phallic. Eventually, a little bit later in the movie, we're going to see the desecration of the Virgin Mary statue. And I think that this represents a grotesque attempt at reconciling opposites, kind of merging the Pazuzu statue and the Virgin Mary statue with this result. Because this attempt is so grotesque and simple, it doesn't result in the resolution of the emotional tension that's developing in the movie and in the characters of the movie, including Reagan and Karras mainly. In fact, the result of this grotesque union of opposites is it's almost trying to turn the statue of Mary into the statue of Pazuzu, uh, by giving her a phallus and making the whole thing grotesque and demonic, if you will. Besides this failed reconciliation of opposites, the opening sequence also shows us a couple more union of opposites. The first one, in the archaeological excavation, we see a figure of Pazuzu on the same archaeological level as medal of Saint Joseph. These two are not supposed to be there together. They don't. The Saint Joseph medal doesn't belong there. Uh, so the important question here is, what does that mean? Not so much how did it get there, but what does it mean? On the one hand, Pazuzu is a demon, but also is a protective figure. He protected children against other demons. And Saint Joseph, he took care of Jesus as a child. One is a pagan, so they have that in common. On the other hand, one is pagan, one is Christian. So this is another way in which the film is telling us that it has a mythic structure and it's going to be dealing with a reconciliation of opposites. Some of these attempts more successful than others. In fact, the fact that this first sequence takes place in Iraq is telling also, because Iraq being the cradle of civilization, it stands as symbolic in this context of the emergence of consciousness out of the unconscious. So the emergence of organized, civilized life in cities out of more disorganized, chaotic lives in tribes. It can be seen as symbolic of the emergence of the consciousness out of the unconscious. So Iraq itself is a reconciliation of opposites in that sense. We also see something interesting in that sequence, and is the moment where the clock stops as Mary is examining the St. Joseph medal and then the Pazuzu amulet. This is what Jung would call a synchronicity, and a synchronicity is, he described it as an acausal connective principle. I'm sorry. So two things are connected, but neither causes the other. In this case, the examination of the amulet and the medal is one thing, and the clock stopping is the other thing. Neither cause the other, but they are related. What are they connected by? They're connected by meaning. So that's the connective principle in synchronicity. It's not that one causes the other, but that they are both connected by meaning. And on the one hand, I think that the meaning is that we can see the stoppage of time as a representation of the movement from the temporal realm consciousness, everyday life, to the atemporal realm, the unconscious, and the supernatural. Also, the clock stopping may represent the fact that Marin's time is up. He has run out of time, because the battle between these two opposites that he is examining, Pazuzu and San Joseph, will cost him his life, as we see later on in the movie. And now we get to Father Karras. Father Karras is 46 years old, and he's right there in the middle age stage of life. And like we saw, according to Jung, the main task at this point in life is the integration of the neglected function, in this case, feeling, which is associated with his anima, to integrate that back into his consciousness. He's a psychiatrist, but he says that much of what he does involves more dealing with other priests' loss of faith than anything else. And in fact, he's dealing with his own crisis of faith. And this is like we saw before, because thinking is his dominant function. And this dominant function has gone unchecked and unbalanced by anything else for too long. And a key issue that Karras is facing in the movie is the condition and situation of his mom. I think that Karras' mother serves as a symbol of his anima, both the mother and eventually Reagan. Uh, Her mother is living in an abandoned and decrepit neighborhood, and Karras expresses a desire, a conscious desire to want to be near her, or psychologically to integrate his anima into his conscious life. He feels guilty about his mom's health crisis, and in fact, sadly, eventually she dies on her own, and her body is not discovered until she's decomposing. So he fails to integrate his anima to his conscious psyche. That's because he's trying to do that solely by the use of reason. And the successful integration of Kara's anima into his life is not going to happen until he has a supernatural encounter that will help him achieve that. So we see Karras is having a dream, and the first sequence of the dream goes like this: there's a menacing black dog, and then we see his mother's face, and then we see a pendulum clock symbolizing time. And I think that that trilogy it's symbolic of his mother's impending death. After that, the mother exits the subway station. Kara sees his mother, and he waves and yells at her desperately, but she cannot hear him. She's crying and pleading, and he runs to her, but he cannot reach her, and she goes back down into the subway. So I think the meaning of this is that Kara's anima is in need of saving, rescue. That's his task at this stage in life, but he cannot reach her. His efforts are based on willpower and reason, are in vain, and she goes back into the unconscious, represented by her walking back down into the subway. At that point in the dream, the metal falls to the ground, and we know that when that happens, his fate is sealed. Because he has failed to integrate his feeling function into consciousness. He has lost his faith, and therefore he doesn't have the protection that he will need against the supernatural forces he will be facing. Interestingly, the scene after the dream is the communion. He's preparing, he's doing the ritual for the communion, what's called transubstantiation, which is the bread becoming the bread and the wine becoming the body and the blood of Christ. And in the Catholic Church, this requires the highest degree of faith, and it's also a symbol of the reconciliation, another reconciliation of opposites. In this case, the incarnation of God, the immortal form, and eventually dying. After all this, we finally get to the first encounter between Karras and Reagan, and this meeting represents the return of the repressed. Everything is here now. Reagan as the deformed, unattended, grotesque anima that he has not developed. The shadow, as we saw, Pazuzu as representation of the shadow, and the mother, who Pazuzu says, your mother is here with us. So all there came back violently for Karras because he was unable to deal with the task of integration of his anima. He now has to deal with it in this grotesque form. Jung would say that if you don't take care of the task at hand psychologically, then the unconscious will overwhelm you and make sure that you deal with the task at hand. So in this case, the unconscious is overwhelming Karras with the issue of taking care of his anima. He cannot go on living with reason alone. This meeting leads to Karras eventually subjugating the dominant function due to the encounter with the irrational and the supernatural. And there's a couple of things that Reagan or the demons say during the movie. The first one, when Karras is playing the tape backwards, Pazuzu says, "I am no one." So Pazuzu, or the shadow, or everything repressed, the feeling function, the anima, is a part of the psyche that resides in the unconscious and therefore has not been incorporated into consciousness, doesn't have a name. You are not relating to it. And that's why the demon says, "I am no one." And the other one, when the words "help me" appear on Reagan's belly, giving Karras his task, which is to rescue the anima, is what Jung would call the hero's quest. Even with all this, when Karras is presenting the case for the exorcism, he's still not convinced that the possession is real. So even at this point, right before Mering enters the picture, reason is still firmly his dominant function, and he's not ready to let go of it. Enter Father Mering, and Father Mering in the movie serves as the archetype of the wise old man, one of the archetypes that Jung described. This is a figure that guides the hero in his quest, in his task. So it's Mering is the one that will be helping Karras to balance his psyche so that it's not so overwhelmingly ruled by reason, that he incorporates, even if it's a little bit of feeling, of the feminine function, of anima, of the shadow into his psyche. It's almost like he tried to repress the shadow so strongly for so long that eventually it erupted back with a vengeance in the form of a confrontation with the possessed girl. Mering is going to show Karras that there are other ways to deal with reality besides pure reason, things like intuition and feeling. In fact, when Karras wants to brief Mering about the case, Mering says there is no need. And when Karras says that there are 3 personalities inside Reagan, Mering responds, no, there is only one. So that establishes that Mering is already showing Karras a different way of approaching the problem. During the exorcism ceremony, what Karras receives is a constant assault on reason. I mean, he gets the works: levitation, telepathy, telekinesis, spiritual war, everything. In fact, at one point, the mother briefly occupies the place of Reagan in bed, emphasizing that Reagan and the mother fulfill a similar psychological function in Karras as an externalization of the anima. And after the first round of the exorcism, Karras is a changed man. He's physically beaten, he's morally humbled, he's intellectually defeated, and his rational worldview has been demolished. This is similar to what hero figures go through, called the dark night of the soul, and also what some people in some cultures go through as part of initiation rituals. And this whole process opens the possibility of psychological transformation. So Karras is now ready to fulfill his task. When Mary dies, Karras, in an act of despair, identifies with the shadow. So he takes a shortcut, and instead of incorporating aspects of the anima and aspects of the shadow into his conscious psyche, he goes backwards, and his conscious psyche, his ego, identifies with the shadow. That's why he says, "Take me, come into me." But this would only lead to the destruction of his ego. During an altercation with Reagan, he physically loses St. Joseph's medal, and now, like in the dream, his fate is sealed. But for a brief meaning that he's going to die. But for a brief moment, Karras regains control of his faculties. We see that when his face turns back normal briefly, and he chooses a last act of his own free will, self-sacrifice, as a way of both saving Reagan and dying with dignity. It's in that moment that he finally achieves the task at hand and redeems the anima as represented by Reagan, and chooses a final act of love as the ultimate form of feeling, and sacrifices himself for that purpose. And his last confession, I think, confirms that with his actions he attained salvation, or psychologically speaking, he was able to again complete his hero's journey and his psychological development. So that's what I have for Karras' character arc. My next video is going to be concentrating on Reagan's character, and how the Exorcist has what I consider to be a structure fundamentally identical with fairy tales. I think that the Exorcist is basically a dark fairy tale, but we'll see that next time. Thank you, everyone, for your time. As usual, you guys take care, and I'll see you next time.